Good day to everyone joining us for today's webinar, Planning Your IBM I Security Budget. My name is Luke Probasco with Townsend Security. We will be recording this session and will make the recording available within the next day or two. Running time for today's presentation will be about 40 minutes with additional time at the end for questions and answers. And if you have a question, please use the question function in the right-hand column at any time. All questions will be posed anonymously at the end of the session, and if you can't see the questions section in the right column, click the plus or arrow symbol next to the word question to expand that section. Ready to get started now, so I will introduce today's presenters. Patrick Botz is an internationally known information security expert, specializing in security as a business requirement first and as a technology second. He held several positions at IBM, including lead security architect and founder of the IBM Lab Services security consulting practice. Patrick holds several security-oriented patents. Also joining us today is Patrick Townsend. Patrick is the founder and CEO of Townsend Security. With more than 30 years of IT industry experience and data security expertise, Patrick brings us a unique perspective to IBM I security technologies. We will have Patrick Botz start things off. Anytime you're ready.
Actually, we're gonna have Patrick Townsend start things off.
Yeah, Patrick, I'll do the introduction here, and then you're kind of the star of the show. I'll turn this over to you. Welcome everybody today's webinar. I'm just really happy to have Patrick Botz join us today. Patrick is certainly a star on the IBM I security arena. Today's agenda is really interesting. We're going to talk about really the budgeting and planning process for security. As a solutions provider, we often really look at the implementation and the putting solutions in place to help meet the overall requirements of security. But of course, that really only works well when there's a proper process in place, including both planning, implementation, execution, measurement and feedback, and repetition. So I'm really happy to have Patrick Botz here as a security professional. He helps a lot of IBM I customers go through this process, mostly he's going to take the lead in talking about security planning. Here at Townsend Security, we provide solutions for IBM I customers as well as Windows, Linux, and IBM mainframe customers. And so I'll be pitching in periodically at Patrick Botz's prompting, really to talk more about some of the solutions part of this. But largely, today's agenda is around the whole planning and budgeting process, which is just crucial both to make sure ducks are lined up in a row in terms of your security strategy, as well as actually getting security done. So I'm going to turn this over to Patrick Botz. So Patrick, why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thanks for having me once again. It's always a joy working with you guys and talking security. Today, what I'd like to talk about is how you decide where you need to spend money. And in order to make that rational decision, the first thing you have to do is look at security from the aspect of what it really is, and that's a business management process. I'm sorry, a security management business process. So what I like to say is security is a verb. It's not something you have, it's something you do. It's an ongoing business process. And when you look at it as a business process, then lots of the questions that a lot of organizations struggle with when it comes to security actually make more sense, and it makes them easier to answer. So with respect to allocating your security budget, you take each phase of the business process and you look at each one and you analyze it and you ask yourselves questions about your organization pertaining to that phase, and then you'll start to tease out potential projects that need to be on your list of potential things to allocate. And then once you have that list of projects, then you can go through and sort of rationally prioritize based on your organization's specific situation on which ones will be a higher priority for funding. It's important to understand that, like any business process, you're never going to be done. You can't achieve everything in one budget cycle, and so it's a repeatable process. And also understand that requirements change, and just because something was on your potential projects list one budget cycle doesn't mean it will be on there in the next. Patrick, what sort of experience do you have with that aspect of security, the treating it as a business process?
Well, I find that fascinating, and when you said it's never done, that just rang a bell for me, because I think for those of us who have a technical background, we tend to see projects having a start, some work gets done, and then we're done and we move on. With security, we're never done. We're always reassessing, looking at new threats, replanning. So it's a continuous process. I think that's a bit of a challenge for most of us in IT. So that's pretty cool. So the planning, I think the planning phase is great. I'm just going to let you take the lead here and talk about that.
Mm-hmm. So the planning phase of the security management process is where you define what secure means to your organization. And the output of this phase is something that everybody has heard about, quote unquote, security policies. But very few organizations, especially in the small to medium size organization level, actually have formalized and documented security policies. Now, what the policies do is they define, I like to call them behaviors. It's not a technical description of we will set this knob to this value and turn this dial to this location. It's not that at all. It defines behaviors that your organization has determined it either needs to require, prevent, or encourage or discourage in order to properly protect the information assets of your organization. Now, typically, specifically, the responsibility for planning, it actually rests at the corporate leadership level or at the top levels of the organization. One of the things that actually formalized that was the Sarbanes-Oxley law that makes certain corporate officers responsible for the accuracy of their financial data. That was not a technical requirement in any way. It just held those levels of the organization responsible for accuracy. And part of the reason for doing that was to try to get the corporate level of leadership to understand their role in security. Now, we don't expect that CEOs or presidents of companies or CFOs will directly participate in the planning process, but it's their responsibility to make sure that that the entire security management process gets executed, and it's in defining the behaviors in an organization that are needed to protect data is something that's ultimately their responsibility, but they'll likely delegate. And there's lots of different parts of the organization that need to have some sort of representation in this process, including administrative folks like HR, the operational folks, financial, and legal. And oftentimes, IT ends up having to drive this process. But the important thing at this level of the process is that it doesn't become an IT-specific function. IT needs to make sure it happens, but it has to be kept at the non-technical level to produce the right results. If you don't define security policies, then there's no way that you can know if your information assets are appropriately protected. Patrick, where do you run into policies, and what's your experience been with the organizations you deal with and how they handle this level of the process?
Yeah, it's amazing to watch. I mean, if we look back over the last 2 to 3 decades, we've seen IT organizations aligned with the business team, and and then what we find typically is that the business team really thinks in terms of the bottom line, right? How are you going to reduce my expenses, or how are you going to improve my revenue? And security is hard to get to fit into that paradigm. That becomes the real challenge for CIOs and IT people to start talking about security. So I think that alignment probably was good in terms of the bottom line for companies. There are certain things that don't have a specific ROI that are still important, and I think that is the challenge that we see both security professionals and IT folks and CIOs struggling with, is how to communicate security needs to a business team that is really not versed in them. Certainly, as you said, Sarbanes-Oxley, SOX audit will call that out. Section 404 challenges there. Suddenly, those will be, noted on the financial statements if there's not appropriate controls and security. But I think that's the real challenge, whether you're publicly traded or not, is how to do that communication. And it's tough. It's a tough thing to accomplish, but it is what we have to do, is to talk practically. I think the Sony breaches and the Anthem breaches probably really woke up that the business executives across the spectrum. Those were substantial breaches, had a direct impact on boardrooms and executive management. So I think it's changing a bit, and there's another, and that becomes a way to start talking about this to the executive team. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And it is an opportunity. I recently, like in the last couple of weeks, happened to meet somebody who is a CFO that he's typically brought into organizations when they're about to do an IPO or just after an IPO, and he typically will stay there for 1 to 2 years at most and then move on. And I took an opportunity to annoy the heck out of him with a bunch of questions. And one of the interesting things he said that just, it was sort of a light bulb went off in my head is, I kept saying, what if someone told you that your data is wide open and it's nowhere near as protected as you think it is? He said, I don't have time to worry about that. I have a IT person, an IT director who is responsible for that, and if I don't know that it's already cost me money, then I don't have time to even deal with it. I got other things to deal with, and that really struck me as why it's tough to get the senior levels of management involved in this, is because they are busy with other things, and they do need to worry about things that might happen. But they've got so much other things to worry about, and they think they have somebody delegated to worry about that they just don't have time to consider it, and therefore aren't looking for ways to add to their list of responsibility and how they can improve something like security in their organization. So the hard part is getting people to getting management to understand how what their role is, and how they need to set the tone for the organization, but they don't need to have the expertise, and they don't have to add the actual work to their own plates, which is a lot like the rest of us. So when you're planning, when you're going through your security policies, when you're in that phase, looking at that phase, what you need to ask yourself is, do you have a formal security management process? First thing, if you don't, that's an obvious potential project that you should consider allocating budget for. Are your security policies written, and are they communicated? What about newer change regulations? Sure, you might be PCI, need to be PCI compliant, and you may have passed an audit last year, but has a new version come out? And are there new requirements? So you need to keep on top of that and update your policies as those requirements are updated. And of course, if as you execute the security management process, there's bound to be feedback from any one of those steps or from internal or external projects. So IT needs to educate management, which may require budget, and it might be useful at this phase to get some outside help. There are organizations that focus on helping other organizations implement the security management process, and with security policies in particular. Patrick, what's your take on policies? Do you see many organizations that have formal policies? And if so, what do you think those best practices are for them?
Yeah, we do. Typically, it's the larger enterprise customers who, when they come through our front door, they have security professionals who are driving the process, often motivated by a breach in a division or a security event. But we see them typically, the large enterprise, the Fortune 500 customer, typically coming through the front door, well organized, having a plan, maybe creating it on the fly, but at least knowing what the processes are, and ready to engage. So that is, for us, when somebody comes through the front door that way, it's an amazingly fast and easy process because solutions are not hard to come by. But that planning is so important. So large organizations, yes. When we start to engage typically with the mid-sized enterprise or the smaller enterprise, they are often floundering around this planning part, often trying to make it up on the fly. I'm just going to go back to one thing you hinted at. It can be extremely helpful to bring in an outside resource for a couple of reasons. One is they typically can come through the front door with a prepackaged plan, or at least a notion about all the components and elements of what a good plan includes. When you're trying to figure that out under pressure, that is difficult to do. Secondly, back to educating management, outside resources can be really helpful in standing up and delivering a difficult message to the management team around governance and risk management and compliance. And so there are I think a lot of good reasons to think about engaging outside help. We're a small organization, and we do that, and we benefit from it. And so I think that's just one thought that I have for you. If you haven't started a plan and developed a set of security policies, that can be a great way to do that.
All right, thanks, Patrick. So for each of these sections, I'm also going to just provide an example of to help try and explain what each phase of the security management process is about. In this case, I'm talking about a policy statement that was and output of the planning process. And that policy statement is something to the effect of authorized users must use only the computer accounts assigned to them by management. You'll notice that that's a behavior statement. It doesn't say how that policy is to be enforced. It only says that users must only use the accounts that are assigned to them. Typically, a policy will also describe the purpose and give some extra guidance or details if it's thought necessary to further explain the behavior. In this case, the purpose of the policy is to enable accountability and ensure the audit trails provide accurate information, so that if it says user ID Botz is the one that deleted this file, that there's a little chance that somebody else had logged on with Botz ID and actually deleted the file. Some policy statements will give additional guidance, but again, that guidance won't be in the terms of how something is enforced. It will be in terms of high-level terms of things that can be done to enforce that statement. And there are some examples here. The implementation phase, once you plan what you're going to do, then you actually implement what you plan to do. And with security, implementation is how you configure your system and any manual processes and procedures that you might also implement in order to most accurately enforce those behaviors and also most cost effectively enforce those behaviors. So this is the phase that most people deal in the medium and small organizations, that most people think is the entire security process. Security is how you configure your machine. But if you blindly jump into what's the right way to configure my machine without first having looked at, done the planning and understanding the behaviors that you want to enforce, then figuring out the right way to configure your system becomes a whole lot harder and starts to look like there's some kind of magic elixir that's needed to get it correct. With respect to encouraging and discouraging, oftentimes what you will do there is you will show and configure the ability to detect those behaviors. You might not be able to enforce the fact that those behaviors occur, or you might not be able to prevent those behaviors, but oftentimes then what you can do is have the ability to detect them, and that will often discourage or encourage those behaviors, at least among your internal employees. So with implementation, questions you ask yourself is really based around cost and effectiveness. How much does it cost you to implement your machine, to implement your policies, to configure your machines to enforce those policies, and how much will it cost you to manage that implementation over time? And if you determine that there's opportunity to reduce cost, well, there's a possible project. And also, if you determine that, boy, we're not real sure how effective our configuration is, then there's an opportunity for a product to allocate budget to this phase to help you do those things more effectively. Other questions are do you really have the technical skills that are needed to translate those policies into whatever your enforcement is? Are there ISV products out there that can help you reduce your costs or improve your implementation? And then finally, very importantly, one is do you know how your machine should be configured on a day-to-day basis. Because if you don't, then it's really difficult for you to go back and look at that configuration and determine if it's the way you want and need it to be. With respect to technical skills, Patrick, I think encryption is one of those things where a lot of companies, most companies, I believe, probably don't really have the technical skills in order to do that right. Now, they may have the skills in order to get something encrypted, but as you know, just because something's encrypted doesn't mean it's protected, because there's all the key management stuff and where you're storing it and all that. I think you probably have some insights on this.
Well, sure. We would always say that there are a lot of things you can do on your own. There's a lot of things you can do with expert help, and then there are some things that you need to do that probably doesn't make sense to do in-house. I think a good example is we all have firewalls that we deploy in our environments. We don't go build those from scratch. That's highly technical expertise required to do that, and it's far more cost-effective to acquire an off-the-shelf product. Same is true with operating systems. I mean, we don't write operating systems. Wouldn't even think about that. That would seem silly. Some technology in the security arena, and including encryption, for the reasons you said, we would agree. It's generally far more cost-effective to find a vendor solution. We're one. We have one, but there are a lot of choices in the market. And the complexity is there. IBM does give us some encryption libraries, but as you said, getting encryption key management right from the ground up is complex. There are lots of security best practices that go into that, and so, yeah, we would agree with that perspective. Certainly, encryption is one of those. There's a lot of rocket science in there, and getting it right is hard to do. The great thing, I think, is that for IBM I customers, that there are indeed some really affordable and cost-effective solutions in the market, ready to be used, and so. I think it makes total sense as you look through the entire plan and strategy to identify places where you can do things yourselves and where you don't. We often find ourselves, Patrick, you certainly know this. We have people coming through the front door talking about password management and policies, and and we often say, look, you don't need a third-party product to do that. We say, go talk to Patrick Botz about single sign-on, and there's something that doesn't even require software, a third-party software. It just takes a little bit of coaching and consulting services. So, yeah, totally in agreement with that. There will be places where you can do things on your own, and other places where it'll make sense to source a vendor product to help you get the job done.
Okay. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, and one of the biggest considerations with implementation is, can I do what I'm doing today more efficiently? Can I do it for less cost? Or is there a way to do this that provides more risk mitigation than the way I'm doing it today? Now, just because you're asking yourself these questions every iteration of the process doesn't mean that you're going to identify projects that you might want to allocate budget to. But it's important to ask the questions and to consider it, give it some thought, and then move on. Other things to consider at some point is whether or not you can change homegrown applications in a way that will make it easier to actually protect the data and also reduce the cost of protecting it. Again, as we mentioned, ISV solutions can make it cheaper, easier, faster. And consulting services can also make it easier to either identify different ways of enforcing policies or can even help you with the process of determining which products, which sorts of third products will most benefit your implementation. In the implementation example for this phase, how you might choose to enforce that policy statement that we defined is through various password composition rules. As I've got some of them here, and you're probably aware of all of them, but these are examples of the sorts of things that you would do to enforce a policy, and these are also the sorts of things that you'd want to document. And we'll talk about in the next phase how you will use that documentation, but it's important to document all of your security-related configuration on your system. And there are actually ISV solutions out there that will help you automate and manage the configuration and or documentation of your system. And that can be very useful and beneficial. And again, talk about that a little bit in the next session. Another thing that we've decided to do for implementing this particular statement is that we are actually going to add to employee education a blurb about the fact that profile sharing is prohibited. We don't want it to happen. It's not supposed to happen, and we're also going to document as part of this education what the repercussions would be if it's found that people are sharing profiles. So the next phase, the execution phase, and this is one that is kind of makes me laugh because really the execution of your plan, once you implement your configuration, once you implement your plan, and then you want to execute that plan. And for security, that really means making sure that your configuration is as you planned it to be, as you wanted it to be, and also detecting whether you are under attack or if people are circumventing policies or attempting to circumvent policies. And finally, the other part of this process is, this phase, is that you also have to, in advance, define how you will respond if you do detect an attack occurring or believe that an attack may be occurring, or that you define somebody circumventing policies. If you don't have that defined in advance, it really becomes a difficult task to figure out what to do when you're in the midst of an attack. Some questions to ask yourself is, have you compared your current configuration to what you intended to be configured? If you don't document your configuration, as I said in the last phase, then when you look at how your machine is currently configured, there's no way for you to tell has it changed? And if it has changed, why did it change? Should it be changed back? If so, why hasn't it been? Who changed it? All sorts of things. So the documenting your implementation is very important, so that as you're executing your security plan and you're making sure that everyone and everything is following that plan, that you can detect anomalies that need to be addressed and may indicate that you're under attack. So Patrick, I know that you're into the whole SIEM world, and can you tell us a little bit about what solutions are becoming more common for this phase of the management process?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Patrick. Well, SIEM solutions, or log collection and monitoring, is the more general area that we're talking about, are just high on every security professional's list, and there's a good reason for that. Log collection and log monitoring can do early detection of a breach, detect the patterns that indicate someone is trying to get access to systems. And so if you look at any list of top 10 or top 20 actions that you should be doing or including in your plan, log monitoring and log collection is right in there. So for that reason, it's almost all almost all security folks consider that a must-have solution. The reason SIEM solutions are brought to bear is because the number of events that are generated are so huge in most organizations, humans just cannot monitor them and cannot see the patterns that need to be seen. So these security information and event monitoring, or SIEM solutions, are deployed to do exactly that. It's just a part of a continuous monitoring requirement. And guess what? All the other solutions that you deploy for security, whether it's encryption or anything else, generate events that have to be monitored. And so SIEM solutions are just really a core part of good security practice. And as you're saying, Patrick, security is something we do. Monitoring is something that just has to be done 24 hours a day. And really, SIEM solutions are part of that. Fortunately, there are a lot of choices of SIEM solutions. IBM, I mean, we're an IBM, we're talking about IBM folks today. IBM has their QRadar solution, but there are quite a number of third-party solutions that provide log monitoring. The other part Patrick, that I think is so important about SIEM solutions is if you have a breach, the first thing you want to do is forensics to figure out, how did that happen? How do I stop it? How did it happen? How do I plug that hole? If you don't have a log history to really look for, it's going to be almost impossible to do the forensics to figure that out. And what that means is you're going to deploy log collection and SIEM monitoring, but you're probably going to have that same event happen to you again, because you won't have the information you need to really plug that hole. So yes, from our point of view, we do not sell SIEM solutions here at Townsend Security. We do the collection of events on the IBM I and the forwarding of those events in a formatted mechanism so that SIEM solutions can use that data. But a SIEM solution has to collect events from your I, from all your servers, from your PCs, from your firewalls, and everything else. So they can do that correlation and detect anomalies across your entire ecology of systems. So yeah, that monitoring is core, and SIEM solutions are just really an important part of this whole plan, execute, and monitoring strategy.
Yeah, and Patrick, one of the things I run into is I'll ask the customer, well, do you have auditing turned on? And they, oh, yes, we do. And then I'll say, when was the last time you looked at any of the audit journal entries? And usually there's a blank stare because they've never looked at it. So gathering the data is a requirement, but it's not sufficient. You have to analyze that data somehow. And in order for that to provide the most effectiveness for you, you have to analyze that again on an ongoing basis. You don't want to wait until you know for sure you've been attacked, because then all that data is good for is to tell you how it happened. You'd much rather be able to use that data to tell you how to stop it while it's happening, rather than 6 months or a year after it happens. So monitoring is just a critical part of the security process. And if you aren't already monitoring and analyzing that data, then you have to consider a process or a project to allocate money to understand what it is your organization specifically needs to do. and how it's going to accomplish that. And as Patrick mentioned, there are third-party ISV solutions. There are also services out there that attempt to automate the analysis so that it brings your attention to only those things that have a high likelihood of representing some sort of anomalous behavior that needs to be stopped or at least further analyzed to understand what's going on. In our example here, with respect to the not sharing user accounts, one of the things we're going to do is regularly compare the current value of all of our password composition rules to those that we've documented to make sure that nobody's backing off on those, or that some attacker hasn't been able to come in and actually change those values to make it easier for them to get into your system in the future. We are also going to monitor the audit journal for invalid sign-on attempts at weird hours of the day, for example, authority failures. Any authority failure should be investigated to determine that it isn't somebody, an employee, trying to circumvent rules, or an attacker trying to access some data to figure out what's in it to see if it's valuable, whatever. We're going to monitor a number of other behaviors and events that the audit journal does keep track of for you, and we're going to investigate those if we find them. All right, the last phase of the process is what I call measurement and feedback. But essentially, the output of this process is input into the planning process and potentially input to any of the other phases of the plan. The primary purpose of measuring and feedback is comparing, understanding that your policies are adequate and meet all of your industry standards, government regulations, or internal organizational requirements. And then once you know that the behaviors that you have are accurate and comprehensive, then you want to test your implementation to determine if the implementation actually and accurately enforces those behaviors. Another thing that the measurement and feedback will do is identify the need for either new policies or, just as importantly, changing existing policies, because perhaps the impact to productivity is too high. So maybe it makes sense to change the policy in a way that makes it easier to implement and enforce, and therefore doesn't impact productivity. So one of the primary mechanisms involved in this phase is obviously internal and external audits. And questions to ask yourself is, are you always in a scramble to answer questions for auditors to get the data they want? Do audits, another question is, do audits actually include looking at security policies? Many IT audits do not. So some expert comes in and they immediately start looking at how your machine is configured, and they tell you, oh, this is right, this is wrong. Well, that actually makes no sense if it's done in the absence of the behaviors you're trying to enforce. So if your IT audits typically are done in the absence of anybody asking for your policies, one of the things you might do is perhaps look for a different external auditor. course, if you have a formal audit plan for the next year, that's something then that you might want to plan for. You might want to try and gather that data in advance. Gathering that data is also not only useful for being prepared for the audit, but it also provides you yourself useful information about potential security projects. For example, maybe you find that you have a very high number of unused profiles that haven't been used in more than 90 or 180 days. Well, not only is that something the auditor should point out, but if you're gathering that data in advance, it gives you a chance to address those problems before the auditors get there. So this step actually closes the loop in the security management process. And in our little example here, which is admittedly trivial, we had an external audit, and they found that QMAX sign-on attempts was set to 32, and the auditors called that out as needing to be much smaller. So we went back and addressed that in our implementation phase to change that to 3. So security being something that you need to do and not something that you have is an iterative business process. And by looking at it as a business process, it makes it much easier to deal with. If you would like to discuss your budget allocation process, or if you have specific questions about allocation, you can feel free to give Botz and Associates a call or send us an email, and we'll set aside a half hour to try and help you work through those specific issues. Patrick, do you have any closing thoughts?
Oh, I would just, just listening to your, your last thought there, Patrick. We as an organization, we go through this process ourselves, and we engage with IBMI customers around planning phases. If you have a plan, it's so much easier to develop a budget, and if that plan is prioritized, it's so much easier to figure out what that budget plan is going to look like over a period of time. So. We often encourage people to contact Patrick Botz or Botz and Associates if they don't have a plan, to really help them get things together. Once you have a plan and you know you're going to do something, it's actually quite easy to develop the budget. Sometimes we all have a little difficulty getting our minds wrapped around budget planning. Fact is, if you know you're going to do active monitoring and you need a SIEM solution, or if you know you're going to do encryption, that part is actually really easy to do, but it starts with a plan. And yeah, I would just just echo what you said, Patrick, about getting some outside help if you need to create that plan. I think at this point, maybe I'll turn it over to Luke, just to talk about solutions from both of our companies. Luke, you have a few things you want to say about that?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Excuse me. And before we go to questions, I just wanted to let all webinar attendees know about Patrick Botz's security services, as well as the IBM I security solutions offered by Townsend Security. Patrick Botz has helped organizations with all aspects of security, ranging from strategic security planning to helping them implement single sign-on. Botz and Associates has successful security implementations across industries such as automotive, medical, pharmaceutical, etc. And they have dealt with every type of regulatory compliance mandate and every level of sensitivity. And you can find more about Patrick Botz and his company at botzandassociates.com. And then also Townsend Security provides data encryption and key management, managed file transfer, and logging solutions to enterprise customers on a variety of server platforms. And over 3,000 companies worldwide trust Townsend Security's NIST-validated MID and FIPS 140-2 compliant solutions to meet the encryption and key management requirements in PCI DSS, HIPAA, HITECH, and other compliance requirements. And from there, I'd like to open up the floor up to questions at this time. We received some good ones during the presentation, but if you still have questions that you didn't ask earlier, please send them in now and we will do our best to them. If you think of a question after we've closed the session, you can email questions to Patrick Townsend at patrick.townsend@townsendsecurity.com or Patrick Botz at botz@botsandassociates.com. And here is our first question, and it looks like it is for Patrick Botz. Do you have any tips for getting management to engage in setting policies?
Yeah, probably my best tip is really to consider outside help, because every organization is different. But the important thing to get your management to buy into first is that they need to be the champion of security. Whether or not before you get them to take a more active role in the security management process, getting them to be a champion of it helps the communication process to an incredible degree. And if people know that the CEO, the CFO is thinking about this and believes it's important, that helps grease the skids for every other part of the organization.
All right, great. And this next question, I think probably both of you guys can weigh in. Can't we just use SOX guidelines as our security policies? Patrick Botz, you want to kick things off?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And the answer is yes, you should use SOX guidelines as a starting point for your security policies, but that's not going to cover everything for every organization. SOX, of course, is primarily pointed at financial data and protecting financial data, but there's lots more stuff you need to protect. So is SOX a great place to start your security policies? Yes, but it's not it's not sufficient. It's not the only policies that you need.
Yeah, this is Patrick Townsend. I'm with you on this, Patrick. If you have a SOX audit, yeah, you're going to start there because you're going to have to satisfy that auditor. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. But I think in our practice, Patrick, you might find this too. There's just a wide range of expertise among the SOX auditing community. Some are quite good on the security perspective, and some occupy the other end of the scale. So I think it's wise to look much further beyond just Sarbanes-Oxley. I would be looking to PCI DSS. I'd be looking to the SANS Institute or ISACA around good practices there, and broaden your scope beyond SOX. Of course, if you're not publicly traded, SOX won't come into play. But I think that broader view, I'm with Patrick Botz on this, that broader view of security is needed to really get an effective solution in place.
Great, and it looks like this question is for you, Patrick Townsend. We have 3 servers. What should we look for in a monitoring and detection tool?
Oh yeah, good question. I go back to Patrick Botz's comments about trying to look at QAudJourn. Yeah, even if you think to look at it, it's really impossible to effectively monitor your system by reviewing those. You make your head spin at all the kinds of events that are typically collected in the Security Audit Journal, let alone the other sources that we have to look at on the eye. QHIST has important information. QSysOper does. We have open source products like Apache Web Servers and OpenSSH that create their own Unix-like logs, and so it's a real challenge. I think in this case, I would be looking for a solution that collects and correlates centrally all the events from both the eye and all your other systems, firewalls, switches, routers, everything else that you deploy. A good SIEM solution will be able to consolidate those logs in one place, give you tools to do queries, give you dashboards that highlight anomalies. You just need that. I mean, there's so much material to look at. A good SIEM solution is really needed for that, and that's not going to be an IBM I product. This is a specialized arena. I think there are 35 or 40 vendors of SIEM solutions that do active monitoring, so we have lots of choice there. But on the I, our challenge is get the data out of all these different sources. Security Audit Journal is probably the primary source, but we have others. Get it into a usable format, and then transmit it to that SIEM solution so they can actually, that SIEM solution can do its work. So I think that's the biggest challenge I think that IBM I customers have, is really how to get that information off of the IBM I platform in real time. That's crucial, because SIEM solutions, when they're doing correlation and they're detecting anomalies, they need to see quote-unquote see events in real time so they can actually draw those patterns, see those patterns. That's what they do well. Good SIEM solutions just can identify those patterns in a blink. So I think looking for a tool that's native to the eye, but is really designed to move that data to a SIEM solution effectively and fast is kind of the core requirement there. Certainly people know that we have a solution, but there are other vendors in the space that do that too. So just those are some thoughts on what to look for in monitoring and detection tools.
All right, thanks, Patrick. And that looks like all the time that we have. And thanks to all our webinar attendees for joining us. All attendees will receive a link to the recording of this webinar shortly. And if you would like more information about Townsend Security or Botz and Associates, please visit us on the web. That concludes today's presentation.